So as I was considering what theme that I wanted to do for my capstone, there were a couple that stood out to me. In particular, teaching diverse learners was something that I was very passionate about. Being able to respond to the individual needs of students, to be able to help them reach their full academic potential, and being able to help them reach success within the classroom. And so that was kind of a passion that I had. But as I started to think about that, I started to think about more of how do I actually know what my individual students need, and how do I know what to do and what instructional supports and academic supports are going to help my students reach their potential and their success. And so that's kind of when I realized that truly at the base of knowing what to do on an individual level for your diverse learners is where assessment comes into play. Assessment is the foundation of understanding how you can respond to diverse learners and how you can respond to their needs in the classroom. And so with that, I chose to use assessment practices and professional judgment as my theme for my capstone project. As I was considering my theme, there were a variety of questions that were going to guide my reflection and my self-examination of the growth that I've made throughout the past few years. In particular, how can I determine the instructional supports students need? How do I already do so within my classroom right now? In what ways do I use observations, learning tools, products, to be able to evaluate students' needs, their misconceptions, and the success that they meet with their outcomes? How can assessment inform both individual and whole group instruction, and how's assessment used throughout time, and what do you actually do with the assessment data that you collect? So those were some of my guiding questions as I was considering my theme and considering my growth throughout the past 3 years. With that, I came up with my competency statement, which is, I'm competent at using formative assessment methods to identify student learning needs and to inform instruction. With examining my growth, let me take you back to the very beginning, to my very first practicum, Teach 297A. And as you can see, I have an example of a lesson plan from that first practicum. When I started out in that practicum, I knew that assessment was a buzzword. However, I didn't really understand the importance of it, and I didn't necessarily understand how to use assessment within my lesson. So in particular, the evaluation that I used within that lesson, I viewed assessment more so as a box to check off, as a requirement as per my university supervisor, something that I just had to include. It was there, check it off, I'm good to go. I didn't necessarily understand how to develop those quality assessment measures. And so within that lesson, my evaluation was simply, were the students attentive during the lesson? That, as you can see, is horribly subjective as a way of assessing their knowledge and assessing whether or not they met the learning outcomes for that day. I also decided that I would assess students on a whole group level, stating, are students able to solve the problems as a class? When you look at it as a class, it's very broad, that's very vague, that's not giving me any data about how I can actually inform my instruction, and it wasn't telling me any specifics about how students were doing with respect to the objectives that we had. So kind of reflecting over that first experience, that first practicum before I was even formally admitted into the teacher education program, I lacked an understanding of the purpose of assessment. I lacked an understanding of how do you use the assessment data that you gather, and I didn't fully understand what assessment measures you could use and how they would be quality, tangible, concrete data. My data was very subjective, and it was based all on observation of apparent learning. So with that, let me take you into my next practicum when I was formally admitted into the program, to my math block practicum, where I have another example of a lesson plan and the assessment from that lesson. So it was within my math block that I began first trying out and adding different strategies to my repertoire of assessment. I began testing out how to use formal assessments and how to use informal assessments within my lesson. In particular, this was the first time that I used tangible written homework as a means of assessing my students. I specifically incorporate that homework to see, were they able to do the problems from the day, and were they able to meet what our learning outcomes were. However, at this point in time, I still viewed that homework more so as a chance for my students to practice, and less so as a way for me to evaluate what learning actually occurred. So with that, I had this homework in there, I had that formal method. I didn't do anything with it though. I was still unsure of how I could use that homework and how I could use that assessment to guide my instruction in the future. I also began trying out different informal methods of assessment at this point in time. This was the emergence, the first time that I used thumbs up and thumbs down within my classroom, demonstrating my beginning ability to assess on the spot to see, do I need to adjust my instruction right now during my lesson? Having them give thumbs up if they understood, sideways, thumbs down if they didn't. Again, that was still very beginning stages of my understanding of assessment. I didn't necessarily use my assessment results after the fact. I didn't use them to guide my lessons and the instruction that I was giving. And I continued, again, just to kind of view that written performance as practice versus as assessment data. It wasn't until I started in my special education practicum that I really started to gain an understanding of how you could use assessment to inform the instruction and inform the decisions that you make as a teacher. Within that practicum, I have a couple of examples of lessons, and it was during my individual tutoring practicum where I began taking anecdotal notes over how the student was doing during a lesson. I began writing down my observations and writing down how they were responding to the specific strategies that I used. In particular, there's one example up here of where I was using a monitoring for comprehension booklet to help the student with comprehension. And in my notes, I write about how he was responding positively to that, how he was able to answer the comprehension questions when using this specific strategy. And as a result, I use that to justify in my next lesson plan, explicitly writing that that is the reason for using this particular method again. In addition, I began using visual data as well. So taking a graph of my student's reading rate, being able to see, is his performance increasing with the different strategies that I'm using? If it's not increasing, if it plateaus, or even if it decreases, that will give me an indication of I need to try a new strategy, I need to try a different method to be able to help my student actually continue to improve his academic outcomes. As you can see, he was above his goal for his reading rate for each time that we took this assessment, and that was showing me that he was responding positively to the methods that I was using, and that those would be the reasoning for why I would continue to use those specific strategies within my class. So reflecting a little bit over that special education practicum, that was really when I determined how I could use the assessment that I gathered to make educational decisions and instructional decisions. I was able to see assessment as a way of justifying my teacher decisions, and was able to use that assessment on a lesson-to-lesson basis. Being able to take the assessment I had one day, using it and planning the instruction for the next. And that's also kind of where I started to use more varied methods of assessment, being able to use that graphing, being able to use anecdotal notes and observations, and written work as well. Finally, let me take you into my student teaching experience, which has really been the culmination of my ability to assess. Within my student teaching experience, I began using more formal methods of assessment. As you can tell, there was one day that I walked around my classroom and I was using written performance, an example of student work right here, to see how were they doing with writing. And it was apparent as I was looking at the student's work that he lacked the conventions of writing. He had spacing, he had very, very little spacing, which made it virtually impossible to read his writing. He didn't use capitals, didn't use punctuation, and this was reminiscent of quite a few of the students' work as well. And so as a result of recognizing these student needs with respect to writing, I adjusted my instruction the next day, and I developed a checklist that I could actually incorporate into my lesson on a whole group level to help students better monitor their conventions of writing, helping them to use a checklist of capitals, spacing, punctuation, what have you. As a result of doing this whole group instruction, you can take a look at the next writing assignment that I had for my student. This is the exact same student. He began using correct capitals and punctuation, and his writing became much more legible and much more readable. But beyond that whole group checklist and that whole group response to the assessment, I also recognized that this student's particular need was spacing. And so I gave that student an individual space eraser to help him with his spacing in his writing. Again, as you can see, you can now see the individual words and you can actually read them. As a result of using that space eraser, that's demonstrating the actual improved academic outcomes of the instructional decisions that I made based off my assessment data. Beyond using that piece of written work, I also began using formal methods such as exit tickets as a way to assess my students and their learning. After each lesson, I would have them do an exit ticket, so a particular problem or a written task, to demonstrate were they able to meet those objectives, or is there some sort of misconception or misunderstanding that I need to address the next day. Beyond just using exit tickets, I use them across academic content domains. So here I have an example of an exit ticket for math, demonstrating that the students did meet that academic learning outcome based on this exit ticket right here. I also incorporated exit tickets in science and in reading as well. So using consistent use of those exit tickets to see, did they actually reach and make academic growth with the lesson for today. Finally, in my student teaching as well, I began using more off-the-cusp assessment to determine where they are initially at. During one of my instructions, one of my lessons, I noticed that one of my students was having a significant difficulty with identifying certain letters with certain sounds. And so off the cusp, I took that student aside and I assessed him on his understanding of letter sound correspondence with capitals, capital letters, capital sounds, lowercase sounds, and being able to identify which are the letters that give him difficulty, so what can I incorporate then from that point on to help him with his letter sound correspondence. And last but not least, I began doing more self-assessment within my lessons as well. There was one lesson I had where I had my students at the very end, I had a scale of 5 emojis, depending and showing how they felt about that particular concept. 1 being the worst, 5 being the greatest, and they actually got a sticky note to show how they felt that they understood that lesson. And as you can tell, I had 2 of my students who initially put a 1, which was the very lowest that they could get on the scale, showing that they didn't understand it and they were very frustrated by it. As a result, for the next day during bell work, I planned small group intervention for those 2 students. I went over on an individual level the concepts of that subtraction with the bar model again, helping them using alternative methods of instructing with that concept. As a result, then I reassessed the whole class later that day on that same concept, and those 2 students reassessed themselves. One of them went from a 1 to a 3, and the other from a 1 to a 5. That was also showing that academic growth and those improved outcomes as a result of my instructional decisions based on those assessment results. Overall, kind of reflecting over that student teaching experience, I developed an ability to use assessment from lesson to lesson throughout time. I developed my ability to use the assessment results that I get in planning instruction and in planning individual and whole group supports. I used both formal and informal methods such as exit tickets, written performance, oral performance, observations, and self-assessment. And I also demonstrated ability to adjust whole group individual instruction across content domains. Overall, when I kind of look at my growth throughout the past 3.5 years, to sum it up, I started with an understanding that assessment is important, but I didn't understand how to assess. I didn't understand what measures to use to assess. As I continued to go through my practicum and my field experiences, I added more strategies to my repertoire, both formally and informally. I began to learn how I could assess on a daily basis and how I could use those to inform the decisions that I made. I also learned how I could assess whole group individually to determine initial understandings and to determine what supports could be incorporated into instruction for students. Even though I had significant growth throughout the past 3.5 years, I recognize that there's still room for improvement in my ability to assess. In particular, there's 2 areas that I hope to improve. I hope to improve my ability to use technology as a means of assessing, as a tool for assessing where my students are at to begin with and where they're at the end of a unit or a lesson. Furthermore, I want to develop my ability to involve students in self-assessment, helping them to understand what methods can they use to determine if they understand or if they don't understand a concept, and being able to use their self-assessment as a way to track their progress and their growth. Lastly, assessment methods are going to continue to evolve throughout time, and so part of my growth will simply to remain recent and up to date with the different assessments that are published and the different methods that come to light. So being able to engage in collaborative practices with my colleagues, being able to share different assessment methods, being able to do independent research, going to conferences and workshops, simply to be able to stay up to date with what assessment methods might be used within my classroom context. With that, I'm competent at using formative assessment measures to identify student learning needs and to inform the instruction that I give to my students.